Welcome back to Let's Combinate. I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh, and in today's episode, we are honored to have Bill Facteau, who is the president and CEO of Earlens Corporation. He has a distinguished career over 3 decades in medical devices. Bill has spent a lot of his career focused on hearing and has been at the forefront of groundbreaking innovations aimed at improving the situation for people with hearing loss. At Earlens, he leads the charge in transforming hearing aid technology to address the critical issue of untreated hearing loss. So you've spent a lot of your career on hearing, and hearing is one of those things that on the list that, like, there's this saying of everybody's a rich person. They just basically measure it by their bank account. And if you were to sell your eyesight, how much would you sell it for? And if you were to sell your hearing, how much would you sell it for, kind of thing. And so what got you into this field? Was it like a good career opportunity that ended up being a wider calling, or was it the opposite?
I've been in the ear, nose, and throat business for about 20 years or so. Our first company, Acclarent, was focused on ear, nose, and throat disorders, and there were a number of things that we had identified back then that were what I believed were opportunities, unmet needs, significant quality of life issues. Sleep apnea was one of them, but hearing also was a big one. And so I transitioned from Acclarent, and as we're starting to think about other opportunities, this opportunity with Earlens presented, and one of my very good friends from college suffers from hearing loss, and he was always complaining. He's always losing his hearing aids. He was always complaining that they don't really help him in noisy situations, and that the technology just spent $8,000 on it, doesn't work. I had mentioned that I was contemplating taking this position. I just joined the board of this company called Earlens, and I walked him through it. He goes, "Listen, if you guys can do that's a game changer." And so that kind of piqued my interest. I spoke to a lot of the ENT friends that I had over my time at Acclarent, and many of them said, this is a big issue. It's only getting worse. The technology is average at best. And if you really wanted to make a difference in people's lives, figuring this one out would go a long way. And so I ended up joining 11 years ago as the president CEO. And we continue to work on delivering on our vision to treat more patients, educate, screen, diagnose, treat, service these patients over time. But one thing that has changed, I will say, over the last 11 years is the importance of treating hearing loss. It's really been perceived for decades and decades that this was some benign side effect of getting old. And we know that's no longer the case.
Now, you mentioned your friend and kind of his situation. Like, what are the legacy, sort of the mainstays as far as hearing loss? Is it just a microphone with a speaker where, like, people can't hear, so let's just get the noise closer to the eardrum? Because you mentioned that his main issue was, like, in loud situations, it's useless.
Yeah, I'll never forget on that same conversation. He was piloting a new technology, if you will, which was a companion mic. So he had me put the companion mic on me, and I walked across the bar, and we started testing it, and we threw it away. It wasn't working. But the challenges with air conduction hearing aids are, and I'll say we're a proponent of air conduction hearing aids as part of our new business model. We do distribute and dispense air conduction hearing aids, and they are better than nothing. They work in certain situations with certain people that have a certain type of hearing loss. They're not for everyone, but they're better than nothing. And you've described it right. They all have the same exact mechanism of action. They have a microphone on a processor that has the electronics. Most of those sit behind the ear, and they pick up sound, and they then digitally will work through state-of-the-art digital processing to process that sound, and then they'll amplify it through a very tiny speaker that sits in the ear canal. And the problem with those are that due to the physics of that speaker, is that they can only provide a very narrow frequency range from about 800 hertz to 4 to 5,000 frequency range, and at best. And normal hearing for adults is about 100 hertz to 10,000 hertz. And so when people get air conduction hearing aids on, they get this amplification that does not sound natural, crisp. It's very tinny, and they complain,
Mm.
and they're not being provided a lot of the information in those higher frequencies at 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000 hertz that are really important in our English language and other languages. And that's the fricatives, the consonant sounds. And so for people that are in noisy environments where the audibility is really important and these audible cues, they're not receiving. So it's very difficult for someone that has hearing loss in a difficult, complex hearing environment to distinguish the difference between, did you say that guy is 55 and funny, or it's 65 and sunny? Because they're not
Mm.
able to get that information. And so it's a challenge. And so we typically see air conduction hearing aids will help people probably 35%, make it 35% better in these word recognition type complex situations, but certainly not perfect. And that's the biggest challenge with hearing loss, is that hearing loss is not curable, but it is treatable. Hearing aids help, but they don't provide the equivalent of 2020 for glasses and vision.
So that's I'm glad you ended the answer with that because that was going to be my next question. I am a hearing guy. I love my sense of hearing. It's one of the things that I value most in life, and I also have poor vision, and I don't have poor hearing, and I'm used to like the 2020 analogy. And when I was preparing to talk to you, and I was looking at the frequency range, I was thinking like I saw that like the conduction hearing aids, they have that range that you talked about, which is not the entire range. And then there's a range of sound that is not capturable, not processable, whatever the terminology is. And I was just like, is it the same thing as like 2020 vision? So if you have 2020 hearing, let's say you can hear really low frequencies, you can hear really high. Is it like that?
Yes,
People don't
perfect.
say that.
No, and that's part of the challenge is most everybody knows what perfect vision is, but most hardly anyone knows what perfect hearing is. And perfect hearing for us here is about 100 hertz out to 20,000. So when we're 14 on average, we're going to hear the best that we can. And it's interesting, you hear these apps sometimes, like my kids will play it at a frequency at like 15, 16,000, hertz, and no adults can hear it, but the kids are all laughing because they can hear these sounds back and forth. So over time, as we get older through noise exposure and age, the hair cells start to deteriorate. And that's the challenges.
There's no recouping it.
Nope.
Like there's no cutting
Grow those
edge.
tail cells back. Yeah, that's right. And at least in the near term, there is no cure for hearing loss.
Is there anything you said? We'll get into hearing aids in more detail and things that you can do when you have like actual hearing loss. But is there anything that one can do to slow down the aging process? Because I have heard some of the videos where they go through certain frequencies, and sometimes they're very scary because they say my hearing is a little bit older than what my age is, and I'm like, oh no. And then after doing basic research, it's very common to have hearing loss regardless. Is there
Yes.
anything one can do to slow it down?
Absolutely. Prevention is an option. Unfortunately, though, there's not a lot of efforts around there. They've recently come up with their AirPods. They've got watches and other notifications if it's too loud. And so there is prevention opportunities. Ironically, there are like 1.3 billion teenagers that already have some degree of hearing loss, primarily due to blasting music and wearing AirPods and headphones and things along those lines.
Is it the loudness or is it just the fact that you have headphones with loud is bad and going to say like festivals where they're blasting, etc.?
Going to rock concerts and hanging out by the speaker, blasting, even in large venues and games and crowd noise. And so concerts, bars, games where there's significant loud continuous noise is where the issue is. And so, like we firing rifles without ear protection, those things will catch up to you eventually. Air traffic, being on the ground with big planes coming in without ear protection, those things will absolutely have a negative impact on your hearing.
So there are things that I would assume not doing that would be under the prevention. Don't hurt it. But is there any sleep, vitamins? Can
Not
you
that I'm
do
aware of.
none?
Noise
Okay.
and age exposure. So if we one day if we can slow down our aging, that might help. But the most preventive thing is going to be just take yourself out of those noisy situations. Wear earplugs. Wear something along those lines.
What about as far as kids go? Is it I'll see some people at weddings with babies and they have the air traffic controller kind of looking
Yeah,
headphones on and I'm like it's not that loud in here. Am I
those
wrong?
parents are smarter than you.
Is it really important to protect kids' hearing say before they're 10 years old? Is it a developmental thing or
No, I think
it's just a matter of don't trash it when they don't even understand what's going on?
Yeah, exactly. Don't give them the your hair cells again will degrade over time. You have longer and inner hair cells and these exposures. So it's either going to be noise and duration that those are the things that if you can prevent them, you want to over time. And they'll add up and sometimes you may go to a concert that's really loud and you'll walk outside and your ears are going to be ringing. There's nothing you can do to recover from any damage that's been done. So the frequency, the loudness, and the duration are the things that we can control. And if there is an option to have some type of preventive earplugs, or musicians are also many of them struggle with hearing loss, and you can hear debilitating stories from artists that no longer can participate because they've lost their hearing and of significance. Huey Lewis comes to mind as somebody that's been greatly impacted and has talked about the challenges that he's had and the impact that's had on his mental health by not being able to hear anymore. So it's a big deal.
Earlens's approach is a little bit different. How does Earlens's approach of like directly vibrating the eardrum help improve some of the
Yeah.
issues that we talked about? Because that's what it does, right? It targets the hair cells, but as far as I can tell, Earlens is circumventing that and going directly to what the point of the hair cells even is.
Where we are different, as I mentioned, with the air conduction hearing aids, they amplify in a very narrow frequency range, and the reason why it's limited is because of the tiny little speaker. So if you were willing to walk around with the headset that you have on, which is a closed system, which is big enough to accommodate battery issues, you could get the higher frequencies. And that's why many musicians and others enjoy getting the lows so the bass doesn't come out because it's trapped in a closed environment, and also able to have enough power to get the high frequency. So it's possible, it's just not possible in the form factor of a hearing aid. And so we do not use a speaker. That's the beauty of an ear lens system, is that we actually have a contact-like device that hovers over the eardrum, couples directly to the acicular chain, and we use RF to transmit the sound and energy. So it's a lot more efficient and it's not limited by that speaker. So we're able to provide a bandwidth from 100 hertz to 10,000 hertz, which is the natural hearing for adults. And so we're also not limited in those fricatives and consonant sounds and those high frequencies. So people in noisy environments that are struggling and they're not getting those audible cues with an air conduction hearing aid, get them with an ear lens. And the best analogy I can give you on the importance of these audible cues and the difference that they make. It's a
Where's
complicated
Waldo?
puzzle.
Yeah.
Where's Waldo, right? You have to try to
Yeah.
find him. And the way that we do that is that we know what Waldo looks like, what he's wearing. Is he wearing blue jeans, a striped shirt, a cane, or a scarf? And so that gives us the audible cues to then look at a very complicated puzzle and determine is that Waldo or not. And then when you find them, you're successful in doing that. That's your vision equivalent and your brain having additional information to get to the answer. If you were to think about that in the world of hearing, people that have hearing loss are not getting all of those cues, those audible cues. So it's the equivalent of not getting the colors that Waldo is wearing or the stripes on his shirt. And you are not getting all that. So your brain is working overtime. And because speech is contextual, people will read lips or try to guess over a period of time what people are saying. So imagine if you have hearing loss and everything is black and white in that puzzle for you. It's really difficult to find Waldo or where he is. Then go into a noisy, complex situation and you can't make anything out. And that's why.
And so you end up basically squinting your entire life and having to exert more stress and effort, etc.
That's right. So
Now,
it's the short-term memory, the hippocampus. That's the same area of the brain that's processing the short-term memory, and so you get this cognitive overload. And people are spent by the end of the day trying to figure out and anticipate what people are saying, reading lips, so they're just burnt out by the end of the day, and people are exhausted. And so ultimately it gets worse. And then you're in an environment and you're having to ask people to repeat themselves. What did you say? You're misinterpreting. So people just get frustrated at that and they just remove themselves. You can imagine the impact that has on quality of life.
yeah. Now you just reminded me. I was telling you I'm into triathlons, and one of the things that makes Ironmans in particular even harder is they don't allow you to use any headphones. And they say it's because of safety. Others say it's because it's called Iron Man, not Woodman or whatever. And focusing on the safety part, I tend to understand, but more recently there are these new headphones, the bone conduction headphones. I think they're called Open Runs, something like that. Open Run, Open. They even have swimming versions too, because even headphones for swimming is also. I think it has to be like in the $100 million market for whoever can figure out how to do it, because I've always wanted to buy headphones for swimming and I've never pulled the trigger because every product I've seen, the reviews are absolute trash, and you end up
Yeah.
having to download MP3s. And anyways, so what I was going to ask you is, the open runs have the benefit of your ears are open. So you can hear all the background noise, but it's doing bone conduction. Is that the same sort of mechanism that the ear lens is working through, or is it
Yeah,
different?
so ear lens and most air conduction hearing aids are going to have an open fit. The difference between a air conduction hearing aid and an ear lens is an air conduction hearing aid, you will lose all those low frequencies. They'll go up against the tympanic membrane and they'll come outside your ear canal and you won't get the benefits of bass. If you're listening to your own voice, if you put your fingers in there and you plug your voice, you'll hear a different type of sound. No one wants to walk around with that closed ear effect. So the practicality of closing off the ear canal, and people in the military and others, it just won't do it. And that's why 95% of all hearing aids that are sold are going to be open fit. But the challenge is if you have low frequency hearing loss, you're not getting any benefit from an air conduction hearing aid because all those low frequency sounds are escaping the ear. Ear lens is the only device that provides those lows and the highs in an open fit. And it's the balance of the low frequencies and the high frequencies. It's the combination of those two things that lead to the perception of clarity and naturalness in speech. And that's where our advantage is.
Now, you've mentioned that there's benefit to the existing, say, legacy products for some people, depending on the stage that they're in. Is it like a
Yep.
first line, second line, third line sort of situation where people will, I don't want to say progress to an ear lens? Or is it like, where have you been all my life? It's the ideal situation for everybody?
Yeah, I would say that think about a pyramid, if you will, of hearing loss. The degree and the severity of hearing loss changes, right? So the bottom, the biggest base is going to be people that have mild hearing loss. And they may start to realize that they're struggling. Most times it's a loved one that tells them, hey, the TV's way too loud, or you're going deaf, right? They're telling them that. Many of them are in denial. Oh, you're just mumbling, you're not talking loud enough. But there's a mild, moderate, severe, and profound 10% of that pyramid is going to be in the profound, and they're going to be candidates for cochlear implants. And so that's where the hair cells are completely gone, and they need an electrical surgical solution in order to restore some hearing. But everywhere from mild to that severity, it really depends on the person. And some people, it's a like you would give up your eyesight to keep your hearing, is what you've said earlier, right? And many people are like that. Helen Keller, you can't put a price on hearing, right? And Helen Keller, who was both blind and deaf, has said that given an option, she'd want to restore her hearing. And it's because eyesight connects you to things, but hearing connects you to people. And if you are really, hearing is important to who you are, and you will determine what type of solution you want. Hearing aids are pretty straightforward. You visit an audiologist, you get a hearing test, they program them. You can get them walk out same day. Ear lens is a little more complicated. It's all custom down to your eardrum, so you got to do an impression. We have to 3D print and build your custom product, and then a physician and an audiologist work together to fit that. It's non-surgical. It's placed in a physician's office, and it's going to be more expensive than a air conduction hearing aid. And for some people that are first-time users, they just want the best. They want to be natural hearing and whatever it takes to get there. Others, they just want to take the edge off. They don't. There's vanity issues. There's cost issues. There is compliance issues. There's a whole set of challenges associated with treating hearing loss, and it's part of the reason why it's grossly underpenetrated. Only about 20% of people that could benefit from a hearing aid actually get one. For
Huh.
those reasons,
And when you say vanity issues, it's like the hearing aid showing?
yeah, because I think hearing aids are actually disguised better and have a better form factor than AirPods. But
Right.
a lot more AirPods that are sold annually in the world than there are hearing aids.
And Apple recently introduced a feature for hearing aids in the AirPod
That's right.
Pro
Yeah,
2s, I think.
that's
Um,
correct.
I got
Yeah,
a pair
yeah.
just because I wanted them. So it's all custom, huh? With ear
Ear
lens
lens is
and
completely, our ear canals, our eardrums are like our thumbprint. They're all unique. And even the left side of our eardrum can look different than the right side of our eardrum. So,
what about like reimbursement? AirPods, for example, I suspect that maybe I could be totally wrong, but I suspect HSAs are not going to start fronting for AirPods. But how does the is the cost 100% on the patient or
yeah,
does
so
insurance
Subi,
part?
this is a huge issue, I think, for our country. But as of today, Medicare does not reimburse for hearing aids, so which is pretty amazing when you think about all the things we do cover in our healthcare system, and especially as we learn more and more about the importance of treating hearing loss and the comorbidities. The fact that we do not reimburse for hearing aids, in my opinion, is a big miss. But it's the way it's always been.
It's zero.
Zero, unless you're in
So
part of
that
the VA. There is coverage for vets in the VA, but for everybody else, Medicare does not reimburse for hearing aids, whether it's ear lens or air conduction hearing aids. And the way the government has tried to go about solving for that in an environment where our healthcare system is under great pressure, it's hard to add new benefits without, it's a zero sum game, right? So without removing other things. And it was in the Build Back Better bill years ago, but it did never got approved. There are some chances that in the future we might be able to get a benefit, but at the end of the day, the government's answer was to introduce OTC legislation allowing for hearing aids to be available over the counter. The problem with that's going to be people that self-identify with hearing with mild to moderate hearing loss, and without the expertise of an ENT or an audiologist, I think people are finding that they're really not that helpful. Think about the readers. You can go to Walgreens or CVS or and get readers off the shelf pretty cheap for pretty cost effectively. But if you have more advanced issues with your eyesight, you're going to want to speak to an ophthalmologist or an optometrist. And as you get prescriptions and other issues, the cost ratchet up for those. And it's no different for hearing.
Do you think, as far as adoption goes, because you said 20%, like, is it a cost barrier issue? You mentioned some of the other concerns, but do you think them taking the OTC route has dropped? Has them trying to remove some of the barriers to entry increased adoption in a meaningful way,
No.
or it's baseline?
No, it's estimated. We've had OTC since October. It's estimated that the number of shares is about less than 5%. It's probably like 3 to 4%. And what's interesting is there's a lot of theories as to why people do not get treatment. So some people would say they're too expensive. But if you look in other countries where they subsidize and in many instances even give it away for free, the penetration is not much different. So it's not just a cost issue. Some people would say vanity, and I think that's a different generation. Maybe our grandparents or hearing aids used to look a lot different. They were bigger. There were many of them completely in the ear, covering the ear, and I think a lot of that now that we see stuff on people's ears often, it's less of a vanity issue. But there still is a group, that older population, that do not want to be perceived as being old. But a lot of the issue is they don't really work as well as people expect. So there's surveys over the years of, are you enamored with your hearing aids? You know how many people said yes to that question for air conduction hearing aids? Zero. So when
Really?
you're paying five, six, $7,000 for an air conduction hearing aid and it's not like over delivering on what your expectations were, in fact, it's got many limitations. That's the, hey, I'm paying a lot and I'm not getting what I expected. This dissatisfaction that they don't work very well. The other reason is there's not a lot of education around the importance of screening and getting your hearing test. Most people, believe it or not, there's a study out of the Mayo. Many people will bring their pet to the vet more so than they will get their hearing checked.
So obviously they do that hearing test with little babies, right? It's one of the things that they do
That's right.
before
They
you leave the
screen you now.
hospital,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
screening. And then with kids, at least, there's always a plan to do some kind of vision test, I think. But
Yes.
after that initial hearing screening, I've never heard anybody talk about that. Now, for the people that are listening to this, say person with good insurance, PPO, don't have like the HMO limitations and they can go to wherever they want. Do you just schedule a appointment with an audiologist to see how your hearing is?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to get testing. And now, even on your AirPods and your iPhone, you can do a limited test out to about 4,000 hertz to give you an idea. But a full test should be done through an audiologist. You could go to Costco. Many people do that. Costco dispenses about 16, 17% of all the hearing aids in the United States. So you won't get perhaps as much service as you would expect from an independent ENT, audiologist, medical provider. But at this stage, anyone 50, and these are guidelines that just recently came out this past year from the American Academy of Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery, that all 50-year-olds and older should screen for. Physicians, including the Lancet Commission on Dementia, recommend that 50 and older should screen for hearing loss. And you should at least annually get a hearing test if you're at
Yeah.
that age. And with age, the prevalence goes up. So if you're 70 years old, you have about a 60% chance of having hearing loss.
If you're going to go to Costco to do it, you have to weigh out the proximity to fig bars and Atlantic salmon to
Exactly.
the service you're getting.
Yeah.
Is the Earlens product considered a custom medical device?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how does that, because you were talking about the user and some of the questions and the existing kind of concerns, like just in terms of, I know you're an experienced device developer. In terms of just understanding user needs, I personally never worked on custom or prosthetics or anything like that. But my understanding of the Earlens product, or I should say, the way the Earlens product is set up is there's a baseline element to it, and then there's a fitting element to it that's custom. right? And so there might be some programming that you have to do, or there might be, but there's that fit portion where it needs to be, let's say, airtight. And I don't want to use this as a poor example, but you know how, because AirPods have the noise cancellation, and for it to be effective, it has to have a good seal. And so they have you test the
Yes.
different fittings. It sounds like what you are doing is for the eardrum, but it's also molding to the contours of the eardrum. So it's like a few levels more in terms of customization. But I guess the first question I have on the custom bit is, how do you understand your user versus the custom customer?
Yeah. One of the things that differentiates the medical dispensing of hearing aids versus the over the counter hearing aids is the custom nature of it. OTCs pick up off the shelf, they're pre programmed, or you can self program depending on the regulatory status. For prescription hearing aids, they have a custom fitting nature from an audiology perspective. They are prescribed based off of your hearing loss and they're programmed that way. Earlens has that aspect too on the processor side, but we also have customization in our ear tips. So our ear tips sit pretty deep into the canal. They're very comfortable, and they're the one that's part of where we house the transmitting coil. And it's the distance from the transmitting and the receiving coil. There's that Z distance, if you will, that's important with regards to the amount of output. So that's a nature of customization, and every ear canal is different as well. So getting the impression or a scan of that ear canal and then being able to customize it is one of the things that we do different at Earlens. How do you build a custom contact lens like device that is going to be delivered through your ear canal and placed just above the eardrum? And the beauty of this product is that it's not affixed to your eardrum. And so if you were to glue this on your eardrum, it would come off through just, like a tattoo, a temporary tattoo on your skin. It would slough off over time. So our eardrum is designed to actually move things off of it. And that's pretty amazing in itself that we could keep something there without moving it off. And that part of that is the customization of this that keeps it in place. And we have patients squirt mineral oil in their ear once a week, and it's that surface tension. The two of those things keep it in place. And so that customization is done through a scan or a impression that's done by the physician ENT. And that's why we customize it, what makes it different. But those customizations are done on our end based off of an input of what the anatomy is, and the customer doesn't have to worry about those user customizations. They're programmed for them or built for them.
What are the biggest challenges facing products that operate in this space? Is it more technical that it's difficult with some of the stuff that you were talking about, like the challenges around designing around the eardrum, or is it more the reimbursement adoption stuff that we also talked about?
Yeah, I think the challenges are lack of education, lack of understanding how important it is to treat hearing loss. If people knew that the number one modifiable risk factor to prevent your chances of getting dementia later in life is to treat your hearing loss, I think they'd take it a lot more serious.
Yeah,
Studies, education.
I had a pin actually in that. Sorry, when you mentioned it, and I
Yeah,
was going to ask you the link to dementia. You mentioned it on the fly, but where's that coming from?
ton of data that is now surfacing around hearing loss and some of the comorbidities associated with that. So things like if you have hearing loss and it goes untreated, you have a higher chance of falling. So there's balance challenges associated with untreated hearing loss. And as you get older and you fall, if you break a hip, they have downstream ramifications associated with that. We also know that untreated hearing loss increases your chances of depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, mortality. There was a study published within the last year at a USC showing an increase of 24% in mortality for patients that have untreated hearing loss. But the most significant focus that Fred Lynn and others have done at Hopkins is really around this link of untreated hearing loss and cognitive overload, dementia, Alzheimer's. And the belief is that because the brain is working overtime, where your short-term memory is in the hippocampus. It's competing, and that's where that link is. And so there's continuous research that's out there. I think there's a rightful effort by industry to say, listen, get a hearing aid and you'll eliminate your chances of getting dementia. That's not the case, but it is certainly linked as a modifiable risk factor. If you have hearing loss, you should really get it treated.
You've been in industry now for a while, and you've grown from individual contributor all the way up through leader CEO. Let's say if you were able to rewind the clock 20 years, what leadership advice would you give your younger self?
My former self.
Or somebody sitting in your former
Or I
self
continue
is.
to give my older self. I
Yeah,
think at the end of the
good.
day, listen, I believe it's even back then and now it's all about people. And I think the advice that I've seen in my lifetime now, 30 plus years of working in this space, great ideas that never made it because of bad people and bad execution. And I've seen kind of ordinary ideas turned out to be tremendous successes because of amazing people. And I really think that at the end of the day, as you take on these ventures, they all have their own challenges. None of them are as perfect as you think they are. They all have require learnings and changes, but invest in people and you're going to end up in a good place. And even in the darkest moments that I've had to go through professionally, when I look back, it's because of the people that allowed us to get to the other side of it. Whether those are smart people, did the right things at the right time, made the right decisions. And then usually the bad people are the ones that presented the issues. And the good people that are aligned in morals and ethics and accountability, you want to associate with those kinds of people.
I don't know if you've heard of the book Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker. It's this really short booklet. He actually talks about finding an organization that's aligned to your values. And he says that if you actually go down the course of the feedback loop that he calls feedback analysis, where you're constantly asking yourself, what am I good at? What can I contribute? How do I learn? All those things, is what I'm doing aligned to my values? There's only one direction you can go. If those are the questions that you're constantly asking yourself, you can't be in a situation where you are aligned with a organization or an industry or whatever that is misaligned with your values, simply because it's in your face now. There's a blissful ignorance for the people who are not asking themselves. The last question that I typically ask people is, what's a book that changed your life?
Yeah, I think the most obvious is the Bible. It may not be popular on some of these shows, but at the end of the day, like by far the Bible. From a business perspective, I think there's different strategy books that I think have made a big difference on how I look about blue ocean strategy is one of them. Daniel Pink has a good book on like how to
To sell
motivate
is human.
different types of people, and True North hits home just a lot of what you've just said. And Bill used to run Medtronic, so there's a lot of similarities of how to build great medical devices, make good decisions for patient first. But I think from a sales execution perspective, which I've been involved mostly in commercial stage companies, I've taken them all different stages through clinical, regulatory, scaled them. But at the end of the day, focused on commercial. The Four Disciplines of Execution is one of the best books that I think, if you're really serious about how to hold and grow businesses, hold salespeople accountable, that's a good book. And then The Oz Principle is easy to read. One of the best books on accountability that I've ever read. And I think the spirit there is it's victimization versus accountability. If that were a line, and we all fall below the line sometimes, and we're all victims. The people that are most successful identify themselves as being below the line. They lift themselves up, hold themselves accountable. Those are all good books that I've read in the past. Emotional intelligence. There's a lot to learn there around people and hiring good people and having an IQ high enough over a threshold. But you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You've got the highest EQ. Those folks are probably the ones that are going to be most successful when it's all said and done.
Amazing. One of my favorite things about that question is a lot of times I'll hear books that I have read before, But when I hear a person go through a list of books that I had never even heard of, but they're actually really famous, I love that. So I got the Oz Principle. Where can people find you, Bill?
At LinkedIn, Bill Facto is probably the best way to reach out. And
Awesome. Thank you for coming on.
thanks for having me part of your show. Good luck.